morning and a very warm welcome to the European Policy Centre update, our weekly look at key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role, and for European politics in general. The update was postponed from its usual slot last Friday morning until this morning because we did hope to bring you complete analysis of what had happened at the summit and consider what the outcome meant for Europe. But as you will all know, that summit is still continuing. So we're going to attempt over the next hour to give you a sense of where we are, where we might be going, and what it all means. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC. And as I say, we're going to focus for the whole of this hour on those summit negotiations, now entering their fourth day and due to resume this afternoon at 4 o'clock. European Council President Charles Michel said in his invitation letter to the summit, "A deal is essential, now is the time." So after 3 days, how close are we to getting agreement? What is the likely shape of any such deal? And if EU leaders do manage to reach a deal, what would be settled and what issues would still be left to resolve? With me to discuss this, delighted to welcome special guests this week. She's back, EPC Policy Analyst Marta Pilati, and as usual, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre, and Janis Emmanouilidis, the Director of Studies. As always, totally interactive, questions from me, and then I hope from all of you. Just a reminder, your microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question at any point, click on the hand-shaped button on the right-hand side. Looks like that. I will unmute you when the time comes. Or you can write your question. Just click on the enter a question button. And the usual reminder, please, please, please be as brief as you can so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is directed to. So let's get underway and start by getting a sense of what has actually happened. So where are we now? Marta, perhaps you've been following this since it began. Friday morning seems like an age away. Can you just outline for us briefly, what are the key issues that are making it so difficult to get agreement and that have pushed us into an almost unprecedented fourth day? There was a negotiation on EU treaty reform in Nice in 2000 that went to 4 days, 5 nights, I think it was. We're now on day 4. What is holding things up?
Thank you, Jackie. Good morning. So I would say there are 3 main areas of discussion that have been undergoing so far. And we have seen some progress towards finding a middle ground. And here I think it would be the starting point of the discussions this afternoon once the summit reconvenes. So the 3 areas are size, governance, and the rule of law. As 3 main areas, and then there's a multitude of smaller things that will have to be discussed afterwards. On size, it's mostly about grants, how much grants would be included at the end. We have started from 500 billion. Some of the frugals said at some point even only 150. Now it seems that the compromise could be around 390 billion of grants. The total is still unclear, whether that's 700, whether that's 750. So we shall see what the proposal is for loans. And crucially, where those cuts in grants will end up being in the recovery package. On governance, the main issue here was the demand, especially from the Netherlands and a few other countries, that the national recovery plans that member states would submit for approval on how to spend the money would require unanimous agreement in Council. This has been rejected by many others. The compromise seems to be Michel's proposal of a super emergency break, the possibility for one member state to stop everything and say that the Council should discuss the matter. Now the unclear point is whether the Council, European Council or ECOFIN would then vote at unanimity or at qualified majority. That's still to be discussed. And the third point is the rule of law conditionality, which is referring to a mechanism for the whole EU budget. So it's not just about Next Generation EU. Here, most member states have argued for a strengthened linked and the possibility of sanctioning countries that are found in breach of rule of law deficiencies. Some countries, especially Hungary and Poland, want a unanimous vote on this, on the sanctions, while most of the others are supportive of qualified majority voting on this. So we shall see where that goes, but there is a feeling that once the agreement on size and governance is found, the rule of law will somehow fall into place. But yet to be discussed. And one last notable point that is yet to be discussed is the MFF, so the budget for the European Union for the next 7 years. This is part of the package. It has not been discussed yet. We shall see if it's used as a sort of counterbalance that can be tweaked to appease some member states here and there. So we shall see afterwards whether that is going to be discussed or whether that's going to be just accepted.
Just to follow up on that, that seems a little extraordinary given that we remember the last physical meeting of the European Council back in February was on the MFF. They couldn't reach agreement, and now they've been talking for 4 days and they haven't really discussed the 7-year budget of the European Union. Isn't that slightly extra? I thought the two things were going to be done in tandem because people saw them very much as a package. Why do we know why they focus so heavily on the recovery fund and not on the MFF?
Well, let's say that I would say that agreement on recovery fund is the first step, because that's the new instruments that we're going to be put in place. And if there's not agreement on that, then everything falls. The fact that they have not discussed the MFF yet does not mean that what the Council President Michel has proposed will at the end be accepted as it is. So I think we can expect some negotiations on this later on. But it is true that the MFF has gone from being the main issue on the table in February to something that to be discussed later on. So for sure it has lost a bit relative importance.
I mentioned at the start that this summit could break records for its length. It sounds as if it really might, because if we haven't even started that part of it, it could, by my reckoning, go on for days, but probably not. They've certainly almost had enough. But Janis, Fabian, just turning more to the politics of this, and we'll come back on many of those issues, Marta, a little bit later on. I wanted to quote to you something Charles Michel said on Sunday night at one of the many times the EU leaders have reconvened in plenary. They've had a lot of bilaterals, banging heads together between the most difficult groups. But he said, and he asked the summit a question: are the 27 leaders responsible to the peoples of Europe, capable of building European unity and trust, or through a tear, he said rather poetically, will we present the face of a weak Europe undermined by mistrust? At this stage in the negotiations, Janis, which do you think it will be?
I think that giving the significance of what is being negotiated, that chances are high that there will be a deal, and the fact that Michel was saying the thing you just quoted, and he was saying more than that, and obviously we were all shared what he was saying in order to convey the message, look, yes, we have differences, yes, this is a tough bargaining process, but at the end of the day, we need to find an agreement. There is no alternative, and we will be judged by the outside world if we don't find an agreement. So I think it was the right tactic to put even more pressure, public pressure, on everyone to find an agreement. Now, what you were saying earlier with respect to the comparison to February, I think what all this shows, when actually they were discussing the proper MFF, and now they're all concentrating on the recovery part, the recovery package, recovery facility, and so forth. This just shows how much of a political process that at the end is. Now we live in a different world. What's in February seemed as being unsurmountable now is something which is obvious. Sure, we will get an MFF agreement. Let's not now discuss about $1 billion more or less here or there, because now because of the COVID-19 crisis, because of the new world we're living in, and by the way, Charles Michel in his speech started by saying how many people have lost their lives to indicate of what's at stake. You now live in a totally different world, and thus we are discussing about the 750. We will see how much it will be at the end of the day, because this is now what makes the difference, and this is how we will be judged. Although I still believe, even if we get an agreement on this, this is not the end of the story. If you look over the upcoming months, the upcoming years, but that's a different thing at this point.
We'll come back to what bits of the story are unlikely to be completed a bit later on. But Fabian, your overall assessment of that question, the answer to that question Charles-Michel raised, and to those who are saying, look at the EU, what a shambles, 4 days of negotiation, still not there, may not resolve some of the big issues that are on the table. What do you say to critics who say this just demonstrates the EU cannot get its act together?
I mean, firstly, I think it's clear we're still in the middle of the process. So if this whole summit now collapses in acrimony, if they all go home and say, we are not coming back to talk about this because we can't agree, then yes, we have a major problem. But I think all the indications are that there will be some form of compromise, and that compromise will be criticized by many. It will be the typical European compromise, where everybody is a little bit unhappy, but you can live with the outcome. But that is actually a momentous step, because as Janis and Marta have been saying, we are talking about things which were unthinkable a few months ago. And we're talking about something where we are putting whatever the final numbers, but we're putting a very significant amount of money into cross-border solidarity, into helping countries which are being affected. We are talking about the union borrowing to make that possible. We're talking about getting an agreement on the MFF. And we're talking about something which is not happening anywhere else in the world. This is the only area where we have this real cross-border discussion about how we can address this crisis. And that is, I think, something which is positive. Now, clearly, the European Union needs it because of its structure, because of its interdependence, because of its political integration. But we are in a situation where we are very close, hopefully very close, to an agreement which does really put money behind the words which we've heard over recent months on solidarity, on helping each other.
So Marta, you follow these things every twist and turn ever since the MFF proposals were being formulated. Would you agree that this is truly momentous? We had talk earlier, and many have dismissed it since, that this was Europe's Hamiltonian moment, the beginning of a federal budget for Europe and so on. Would you agree that the momentous nature of what they're trying to do made this inevitable, whether in one very long summit or two shorter summits? Was it inevitable it was going to be this hard?
I think so, yes. We should not forget that just until a month ago or so, some member states were against using grants at all. And today we are seeing that instead now that's being accepted relatively across the board. So I would say, yes, it was inevitable that it would take this long. I don't think anybody expected that the summit would be easily solved. And as Fabian was said, this is truly unprecedented. The EU is borrowing money commonly on financial markets to give grants to member states. This is something that has been strongly rejected for decades, and today it's actually quite, we are discussing about the numbers of this. We're not discussing about the principle, and I think that is the unprecedented nature of this package. Of course, it takes a bit of time to discuss the details, but I would also argue that overall this has been quite done quite relatively quickly. In a few months we have gone from nothing to a substantial package that is that was unprecedented before.
Absolutely. Janis, you wanted to come in here?
Yeah, just a point of addition. Yes, it is unprecedented. Yes, it is of major significance. This is a big step if an agreement is found. However, I'm repeating this, but I need to repeat it. This is not the Hamiltonian moment. It is a one-off, it is crisis related, and we see that the opposition coming from member states, some member states, to what will be decided, the opposition which we've seen to the proposal of the Commission, to the original proposal, stems also from the fact that they want to avoid that this becomes an Hamiltonian moment, that we get a federal budget which will actually be systemic. It will be something which is time constrained, and it's something which will be important in future crises. So if we now have this experience, that we can go back and say, look, at that time in 2020, that's what we did. Let's do this again. This is where it is important, but let's not overstate it, although it is unprecedented.
Fabian, can I just ask another question, another characterization of what is happening? There are people, commentators, critics, people watching this debate saying this isn't about the money anymore. This has become a power struggle between France and Germany and the rest of the EU. We heard Sebastian Kurz, the Austrian Chancellor, he said at one point, it used to be France and Germany came up with a proposal and everyone else got to approve it. It's not like that. We're in a real negotiation. Do you see what is being played out in the European Council building over the last 4 days as much more about who calls the shots, how the EU is run, than anything else? Or is it fundamentally, it's money, therefore it's difficult? So how do you characterize what's happening?
I think it is both. Clearly, we have an element here which is about the fundamental differences on the money, and also, of course, the need of political leaders to go back to their domestic audience and to justify whatever they have agreed in Brussels. And that also means you have to be seen to be holding out, you have to be seen to be fighting, you have to be seen to also defying the will, in the case of the Frugals, defying the will of the Franco-German proposal. But I think we have said for a very long time that yes, the Franco-German agreement is no longer sufficient to push something through, but it is necessary as a starting point. If we could imagine a situation where we didn't have this proposal on the table, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't even have gone this far. So we do need that agreement at the center. But what we're also seeing is a power struggle which comes from the absence of the UK. Just as a little thought experiment, if we had the UK still as a member of the European Union sitting around the table, the kind of discussions we're having now are unthinkable. They just wouldn't have happened. There would have been an immediate veto on a number of these elements. So we would have had to think about doing things outside the budget, doing things in parallel, cutting the MFF rather than expanding it, etc. So I think what we're seeing here is that the frugals, or the smaller states which have that tendency, are missing their big ally. So they have to step up to the plate. In some ways, the Netherlands have become that leader of that small group, and they have been successful in one aspect because they have managed not to be isolated. I think that from the Netherlands' perspective was a big danger that they would end up being alone. They have not been alone, but still it is a very different thing having a number of small states fighting a rearguard action to having a big state like the UK blocking progress. So I think, and that's why we're also at a point where, as Marta was saying, we're now talking about the numbers. We're not talking about the principle anymore. I think that's the big difference to before.
And indeed, French President Emmanuel Macron was losing his temper at one point yesterday and threw out what I think he probably regarded as the biggest insult to the others around the table when he said, "You're behaving like the UK," when it was in budget negotiations under David Cameron, striking that he thought that was the way to really needle them at that point. And I want to come back on the temper and the mood in a little while. But Janis, to this question, and also to you, Marta, about a power game or a money game.
Fabian is right. It's both. There's a lot of money at stake. Obviously, you need to send back to your home audience the signal that we have been fighting. We've done our most to defend also our national interests while having European interest also in mind, but having strongly the national interest in our heads when we fight. You have this, I would call it an isolated, lonely tiger syndrome, showing that I am ready to fight until the last, even if I'm all on my own. I don't care. I'm here for the right cause and I'm doing the right thing. So you have that. But if you dig a bit deeper, there is this concern that you have politically a different balance of power in the European Union post-Brexit. But even when the UK was still part of the European Union, there was an extensive feeling that the UK was no longer in the center, and that there was a need to make sure that the Germans and the French cannot dictate the system. This is overstating things, but there was this fear, and the Hanseatic League was one reaction to it. So we should not be surprised. There is more at stake, and depending on what the compromise will look like, both sides will then indicate, look, we fought, we are able, even on such big questions, to go below what the French and the Germans have asked for. This is what the other side will be saying, and this is important for the future. You will hear that as one part of the narrative, the story about the summit afterwards, assuming again that there will be a success. By the way, just one last point. We were a lot speculating as to whether will we need 2 summits or not. Some of us were saying we might need 2 rounds of drama in order to get to a final compromise. What we're now seeing, and this is why we are probably on day 4, maybe we'll even reach day 5, we'll see. Why we have reached that point is that actually we're fitting 2 rounds of drama into 1 EU summit. So we see an extension of what actually I think we would have probably needed if we were not being pressured by the politics of all this in order to get to a compromise. So that's why you probably have this extension. But again, I'm rather
I'm using that time-honored EU technique. Beat them down, make them desperate to go home, make them utterly exhausted, and maybe, just maybe, that will deliver the final deal we need. And linked to that, a question has just come in from Sabine Frank saying, how important do you think it is that it's been a physical meeting rather than virtual? We've seen lots of pictures of different groups of EU leaders on balconies. We've seen them going to the frittery in Place Jourdain, those who are not intimately involved in the battle. It's an interesting thought. It looks as if this couldn't have been done without this physical. We couldn't even have got to where we are now. I can't imagine, Marta, it would have been done if it had all been virtual, even to get this far.
Yeah, I think that would have been clearly impossible. A lot of these negotiations are informal. So what we have been seeing, groups of different countries meeting to find a common line, but also to talk to the others and see where the landing zone could be. I think doing this online would have been impossible. It would have taken forever, and you lack that sort of personal level of interaction that is crucial in this kind of occasions.
I just want to come back to, I mentioned Emmanuel Macron and some rather angry exchanges. We've heard the word blackmail being thrown about a lot, about the was frugal 4, now termed the frugal 5, with Finland seemingly in that camp, although it always was to an extent. We've heard Macron talking about Sebastian Kurz and saying, look at him, when Sebastian Kurz took a phone call, look at him, he only cares about his press, he doesn't care. Various insults being traded, Mark Rutte particularly coming under enormous pressure and a lot of anger. What is seen as the Dutch intransigent really blocking a mood. But I wanted to quote you, before I get you to react to that, to something the chair of the EPC's governing board, David O'Sullivan, tweeted last night. He is, of course, has immense experience at this type of summit, and he said, budgetary discussions always bring out the worst in everyone for a short while. Once the deal is done, as it always is, more normal business returns. And I wanted to ask, would you agree with that analysis, or are we seeing some exchanges that, particularly as you mentioned, multitude smaller things will still need to be done, even if we do get a deal, and we'll come back on the detail of that later. But if there's a lot more to do after this, even if there is a deal, Fabian, how important worrying is the tone and the bad-temperedness of these exchanges?
Yeah, I think David is right in some sense that yes, once the deal is done, you return to normality. But I think we also should recognize that normality nowadays is very much more bad-tempered than it was in the past. Leaders treat each other very differently. They talk about each other very differently. And they talk about the kind of agreements, the kind of deals we get at the European level in a different way when they communicate with their domestic audiences. And I think that is worrying, because what we are seeing is a much less of a portrayal of the European Union as a win-win exercise, where in the end everybody gets something. But what we often see is a very negative tone, which is associated with other leaders, with the kind of agreements which have been reached. And also using terms like bullying is not helpful. It's not going to lead to a situation where suddenly one of the leaders which is being attacked is going to say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to do it differently. That's not how this functions. So I think, yes, there is a certain amount also of playing to the domestic audience. You want to show the domestic audience that you are also being tough with those who are holding up agreement. But the tone is much worse in the European Union more generally. And I think that also makes it more difficult to see how you then bring something like this home. So you don't only need the white smoke at the beginning, you also then need to sit down and work out all the details. And one of the worst possible outcomes could be that if a detail is overlooked, if there is a crucial issue which has not been resolved, then you could even get to a situation where, despite having signaled white smoke, at a later stage, there's then a backpedaling from some countries who are saying, yeah, but we didn't agree to that part. So we need to be very careful that the package which is there is really solid, it's thought through, and it contains all the crucial elements. Of course, all the detail will have to be worked out later, but the crucial elements have to be there.
Janis?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're not at the end of the summit, so we do not know what will happen over the upcoming hours, however long it will take us. So there might be things still happening if things turn sour or turn worse. However, up till now, yes, we've seen these kind of words being used, blackmail as has been quoted. But I think that that has a lot to do with sending signals to the home audience. We are in a period, we live in times of politics of pictures, so sending out strong pictures saying we are fighting is something which is important. But I don't see that at this summit. Actually, we see that trust is fundamentally and structurally undermined, even in personal terms. We've seen other occasions where heads of state have left the summit and then announced, for example, a referendum, and that undermined trust between the people in the room. Just to give you one example, I don't see that this is happening this time around. But if you look in a longer, over a longer period of time, I think that you can sense that the overall atmosphere in the European Council during the period of the poly crisis, which we're experiencing now for more than 10 years, that overall atmosphere has become more difficult, has been undermined, trust has been undermined. So you have a higher level of fragmentation. But I don't think that this summit, up till now at least, has fundamentally, structurally undermined things in terms of what we will see in a couple of months' time when they meet again.
Okay, and David O'Sullivan, I didn't know, but he is watching this discussion, and he has replied to Fabian's comment saying, I'm not sure that the tone of this summit is worse than, say, for example, Nice. So I think more falling into the Janis camp here than the Fabian one. But Marta, on this point about everyone traditional in any EU budget negotiation, particularly, but any EU negotiation, Fabian said, has to be a win-win. Everyone gets something. That brings me to a question that I'm struggling a little bit, which is the argument over rebates. And we've seen the frugal 4, frugal 5 saying, okay, every bit you raise the amount of grants, the more we want in rebates. Can you explain what's going on there? I had hoped that in the post UK membership era, this argument about rebates would go, because it's always so complicated and hard to follow. What's happening there?
Well, yes, there was some expectation that once the UK have left the Union, all rebates will go away, and rebates are just some sort of discounts that some member states get on how much they contribute to the EU budget, because they would argue that's disproportionate. So some of the very rich countries would contribute too much and so would get a discount. Now the countries that are still having these discounts are 5, and we should not forget that Germany is one of them, and the frugal 4. And the argument of the frugals is what you said. If we want more money, then we want a stronger discount. There's not really another rationale behind that, economic rationale. It's literally just a discount so that they feel that they're contributing less and can somehow be happy with higher EU spending. In these negotiations, we have seen that's been relatively important for them. There's been discussion into increasing their discounts, which also I expect might be even higher at when the final deal is reached, simply so that, as we were saying back home, they can argue that they have won some further correction, and that at the end, yes, we agree to big package, but we don't pay for it necessarily.
Just before we move on to some of the detailed things that may be left undone and how the complexities of this deal, if there is one, what implications that has, I want to take a couple of questions from the floor. And there's one here really relating to how people are lining up. Do you think we see a new structure of political configuration, political groupings among countries in the EU that is different from what we knew even a few months ago? I have seen people pointing to the fact that the frugals, many of the frugal governments are actually social democrat governments, or with social democrats in government, and they are fighting hardest to keep the spending down. And I just wondered what your reaction to that was, but also how you see this in terms of, we've had lots of events, lots of discussions on the German presidency and the expectation of Angela Merkel. Do we know much about Charles Michel's role versus Angela Merkel's role in these talks, the Commission's role, how this is playing institutionally? And then I'll take a question from the floor and we'll get into some more of the nuts and bolts of what will be left to be done. Any sense, Janis, are we learning something new about the political configuration of the Council, and how do you see the role of the different players?
Well, I think that we're seeing over a while that the structures, the balance of power we were talking about earlier in the European Union has been changing. So I don't see that there is now a fundamental change at the summit. What the big change is, but again, this is not something which we're seeing during the summit, it's something which has evolved, is the strong alignment between Berlin and Paris. Is the fact that not only did they agree on the joint initiative, including the 500 billion proposal, which was the basis also for the Commission then successfully at least to put their proposal on the table without it being shot down immediately. This realignment between Paris and Berlin, and not only on paper, but actually them trying their best to get this through. Before the summit, we were seeing how much Macron and Merkel were working on partners to make sure that the chances are high that we will at the end of the day get a compromise. I think this is the big news, and this is the big development, which I think is very positive. And if we would have 4 or 6 months ago would have been sitting together thinking as to whether the German government, Angela Merkel, will be in favor of this kind of a Franco-German initiative with 500 billion grants, with a borrowing at these levels. It's not new structurally, but at these levels, European borrowing through the Commission is totally new. I think this is the big story. In terms of the summit, It is clearly not Michel versus Merkel or Michel versus the German presidency. I think they're working hand in hand. There's a lot of coordination between them, always involving, by the way, when it's in the close circle, also Emmanuel Macron. You never see that it's only Merkel and Michel sitting together, at least in publicly. What we're seeing is that it is an alignment which includes also the French and the German presidency, and Angela Merkel are playing a key role in this. But there are very, to use the words of Angela Merkel, there are very strong helping hand in order to get a compromise. And you can be sure that Angela Merkel behind the scenes is doing the best to make sure that a compromise is being found. But she knows that obviously Michel is in the lead. This is Chefsache. He's president of the European Council, and they're pushing in the same direction, at least at this point in time.
And also putting the odd moment of pressure. There was a time on Saturday night when there was a meeting between the duo, Merkel-Macron, together, and the Frugals. And at one point, Merkel and Macron cut the meeting short and walked out. Was this a deliberate attempt to say, up with this, we will not put some pressure on them? They do seem to be playing that sort of game. We've had something added to this question about political configurations. Have you noticed any negotiating groups apart from the Frugals? For example, are the countries of Central and Eastern Europe aligning their negotiating positions? And there was one specific relating to the negotiating position of Poland, and has it changed compared with the negotiations on the MFF in the past? I know following 27 countries and their specific behaviours here can be tricky. Can anybody, I mean, that general question that we have about who's playing what role, but also do we see any other groups, or is it really Frugal Five on one side, Merkel, Macron on the other, and everybody else waiting for them to slug it out, with Viktor Orban throwing in the odd, I don't know why Mark Rutte hates me type comments? How do we know much about whether other countries are getting together on this, Marta?
Well, yes, there is, on especially the rule of law, this East-West division, and we see that the Frugals have new allies like France, that has always been a very strong supporter of a sort of a conditionality on rule of law. On the other hand, the Visegrad Four, yes, but three of them have been more vocal: Hungary, Slovenia, and Poland. They are the ones pushing mostly against unanimous approval on rule of law sanction. But it is true that on the other hand, that's their main negotiating point. So there is a sort of understanding that they can be convinced in exchange for something else, for example, more funding, whether that's cohesion or recovery resilience facility, that remains to be seen. And I also want to mention some of the southern countries. We see countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece have actually been helped a lot by France and Germany, because they let them, do somewhat most of the talking. But I think something surprising is the Italian Prime Minister Conte. I think he's been quite vocal and he has used a stronger wording compared to, for example, the Spanish Prime Minister. This very much relates to what we were saying earlier. The leaders are talking to national audiences, so we should not forget that Conte is very strongly watched at home. He is at the head of a somewhat weak government coalition. A big win on this would be very helpful, and also would take away a strong argument from the far-right opposition, who's saying the EU is not doing enough. So I think he put himself out there as the main supporter of this package, and I think he has played quite well in putting the argument less in terms of you should help Italy, but this is about the European project and keep on going with European integration.
Yes, so he's not playing, he's playing it not as a national card, but as a good European card, which you think is
driven by some interests, of course, that remain national at heart. But
indeed. Fabian and then Janis, you both wanted to come in on this.
I mean, just to say that I think what we are seeing is coalitions of convenience. We are talking about essentially specific interests which are shared among certain groups of countries. And in that way, it's not actually very surprising. If we had sat down before the summit and we would have said, where's going to be the biggest issue, then yes, we knew there were certain countries which had a problem with the scale, the mechanism of debt-financed grants. So clearly this has also come out. So I think in that sense, it's not surprising. What was always the case was that Germany would have to have a pivotal role. Germany had to be the one who was going to shift into one camp or the other to make this work, and that's exactly what has happened. And clearly Merkel has decided that Germany should be in the camp which pushes through this overall package, which is why the so-called frugals have been left a little bit alone. But when we then come to other elements of the negotiation, yes, there are different interests. And in some of those areas, it might well be that the frugals also then share an interest with Germany. So there's this question about what kind of rule of law conditionality. There are potentially shared interests, but the overarching wish is to get something through. So that is also creating some tensions. But just one warning point, I would say, I think it has become much more difficult to sell whatever comes out as a victory at home. I think that in the past, yes, we had also acrimonious summits, we had difficulties, we had leaders fighting with each other, but in the end, they could go home and claim victory. And everyone always claimed victory simultaneously, and to some extent, that was also believed. I don't think that works quite like that anymore. And particularly those countries which have made rather absolutist positions before we went into these kind of negotiation will have a problem at home, because they will have to explain that in the end they didn't get what they said they would get.
Janis, I know you want to come in, but Fabian, they're mentioning the rule of law conditionality, and we've got a question saying, what will be the importance of the rule of law conditionality at the end? Will it be, as many speculated before the summit, sacrificed to reach a compromise? Briefly, if you would, then I'll take a question from the floor, and then I want to come on to, if we get a deal, what happens next? But Janis, you wanted to react to that discussion, if you could pick up on that rule of law point as well.
Yes, I'll do. I think we will see that actually every member state government will be defending the outcome of the summit as a victory, saying that we got what we wanted. And actually, let's not forget, we will have more than 20 national ratification processes in order to get this thing through at home. So they will have to make a strong case at home that this is the result which they needed, whether they are on the one side or the other side of the divide. But we're seeing a lot of fluctuating coalitions on issues. When it comes to agriculture, there's a group of countries which are defending a certain position, which on other issues, also on some of the fundamental issues, are not in the same group. On everything related to the Green Deal, and how much green the result will be. So you have these fluctuating coalitions. Now, on the rule of law, yes, we see that the Polish and the Hungarian governments, also supported, by the way, by the Slovenian head of government, sorry, are pushing very strongly to make sure that they will not find themselves in a position as governments to be under particular pressure because of new rules on the conditionality linked to rule of law and the MFF and the recovery package. However, having said that, and I'll be very blunt here, a lot of us were saying in the beginning that on the issue of rule of law conditionality, if you are realistic, you will not see that you will get a system in place with actually de facto, not only on paper, but de facto would create that strong of a link between rule of law and how money is or is not being able to be spent in certain member states. And I think we're seeing that again. And I think that the heads of state and government also the ones who are very experienced, they know that at the end of the day, there are limits to what you can do. So I think during the past days, at certain moments, when the rule of law issue came up, it also came up because it was distracting from certain other key battles that were fought, and it was also part of a bigger poker game. So one might say this is wrong, and I think there's strong arguments to say it is wrong, but from a realpolitik perspective, we've said this before, and you can see it over the past days, and I think it will continue, that at the end of the day, there's not going to be the strongest of potential of links between rule of law and conditionality related to the budget.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the floor, and then I want to come back to, even if they do get a deal, what is likely to be the unfinished business, if you like, or where we're going to go from here. But John Palmer, you are self-muted, John. If you can unmute your mic, I can give you the floor. It worked for a moment. There we are. You have the floor, John.
Thank you. I think everybody, excuse me, everybody knows that governments in the European Union are increasingly struggling to understand when an economic recovery will gain ground post-COVID. In that context, and there is a lot of doubts about the speed of recovery, in that context, would you imagine that the summit might build into the Multiannual Financial Framework Agreement a more specific set of review clauses, or a review clause, perhaps deliberately timed after 2 years or half midway, to review whether the scale of action taken is proving enough, given new facts on the ground that will emerge over the next period of post-COVID.
Thank you very much, John. And Marta, if I could add to that in the interest of time, if we do get, and you pointed out right at the beginning that hasn't really been a substantive discussion on the MFF, what is likely to be done at the summit and what is likely to be left? For example, we're talking about everyone having a win-win here. I haven't heard much about how the money would be allocated. In the recovery fund, would it be using MFF rules or different rules, as some have argued, more reflecting the impact of COVID? So how do you see that? And picking up on John's specific point.
Well, on allocation, yes, that has been put a bit on the side, and I think that's because most member states imagine they can live with more or less whatever is decided once the big points are agreed on. On Friday, the new negotiating box that Michel put forward envisaged a change to the allocation method that would take into stronger account the GDP loss in 2020, which is seen as a compromise against critics that countries that would have strong recoveries would get less money, which is a bit counterintuitive, because indeed, the recovery fund is supposed to be for the most vulnerable, but we see when we're talking about politics that allocation matters a lot. So this will be discussed, but personally, I don't think it will be a major point of contentions. But as we were saying, yes, it's one of those details that will have to be figured out. Same for the MFF.
Yeah, more likely to have a serious review clause given the situation.
I mean, that's a good point, because the Next Generation EU will end in 2024, which is somewhat halfway through the next MFF, which will end in 2027. I don't see at the moment a lot of interest for adding special clauses for review, but that for sure will be one of the points that will have to be discussed later on.
Thank you. Janis and Fabian, I'll come to you in a minute, but there's another question I want to put to Marta from the audience, and it links to something she wrote about this week. The question is, did you understand how the discussion on EU common taxes progressed, and what type of taxes are more likely to be accepted? I wanted to put this to you, Marta, because you wrote a commentary entitled New Own Resources for the EU, Don't Kick the Can Down the Road. This whole question of EU being able to raise its own resources, the whole question of how you pay this back, who's going to pay it back, unresolved, not discussed, or has it been and I've just missed it?
No, that's as expected, and as we said, focusing on the main issues, the Council has left to decide other points, including how to pay back the debt that will be issued to finance Next Generation EU. New own resources has been the suggested way to pay this back by the Commission in the main proposals, but member states have always been quite skeptical about it, to give the EU a power to raise more resources independently. I think the risk of not discussing this now, it's that years down the road, we will have to open the conversation again when the maturity of the debt comes to arrive. At that moment, we will be faced with two options. One is that member states will pay more into the common budget, so they will increase their contributions. But I think it's a bit naive to assume that this will happen without strong negotiation. We're seeing how some member states even fight for 1 billion more or less. So the alternative, which is very risky, is that in the future MFS for decades, we will see a cut in EU policies to make up for the extra amount of money needed to pay back the debt. So, and then I think it's a discussion that we should be having now rather than kicking the can down the road.
Fabian, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think, yes, John is right. This is a process. It's not actually a moment in time which will resolve all of the issues. I would say that we also need to see this broader. This is not just about money. We've talked before in previous updates about the 50% problem, and that we are also seeing other things happening within the European Union which will need to be addressed to have a recovery which is also distributed across the European Union. We can't have a situation where state aids in one country are distorting the picture for the whole of the European Union. So yes, there will be a lot more which will have to be discussed. We might well be very quickly at a stage where we say what we are doing now is not enough. But politically, I don't see that leaders will want to come out of this summit having reached a hard-fought conclusion and then giving the signal, but we might need to have a look at this again in future. That would be, I think, a political message which would be very hard to get across, also for the ones who have held out, who have tried to limit this, to actually say at this stage already that in future there might be more money needed, would be a disastrous political signal. So absolutely, yes, there might be a review clause, but I don't think it will be a serious review clause, and it will be the reality which will dictate those circumstances. You will just simply get to the point where it is clear that you have to reopen some of these discussions.
Janis, on this point of unfinished business, and briefly, if you would, you tweeted at an unspeakably early hour this morning, the complexity of the result would leave much room for interpretations and still a lot to be sorted out. How concerning is that they're dealing with such big issues? Inevitably, a lot of these things we're touching on now will be left open. They may not give the political steer that is needed to go and say, okay, we have the political decision, now we do the technical. They seem to be, looks as if they'll stop well short of it just being technical.
Well, I think that there is always and has always been a danger that when you have these big compromises, that there might be certain things which then when you try to technically implement it, also take some political decisions to implement it, but at a lower level and not at the European Council level, they always have the risk that some things might unfold, that some discussions might re-emerge. Fabian was indicating earlier that some might be saying, "Oh, this is not how we had understood the big compromise which we had reached at the European Council level." But I think this time around, this danger is bigger. One is because the complexity of what we're talking about is even bigger. The ability to strike a compromise is more difficult. It's no coincidence it's taking so long. And I think that, and you can also, when you were following some discussions, public and non-public discussions before the summit, you could also hear a good number of people saying, well, some things we will strategically decide and have white smoke at the summit, but then we have to then implement it. There is a danger that this might be more difficult than we see. If you look into the package which was decided some months ago with respect to the ESM, the EIB, and SURE, it took a long time to actually then implement it. On some things we're still not there because, and that was a rather simple and easy compromise. I think that with respect to what's now being discussed, this might be more dangerous. And let's not forget, we might find ourselves then after the summer when these things need to be implemented in an economic situation where there will be maybe more pressure on individual governments to say, are you actually having the national interest in mind? So there is a danger that some of these so-called technical uncertainties when it comes to implementation will be tougher and more difficult than they have even been in the past.
Okay, just one really quick question, if you would, and then I'd like to move to some conclusions. A question here about the role of the Commission. I mentioned it earlier, but the questioner says nobody picked up on it when I mentioned the role of the Commission. Is it because the Commission, despite or because of the Ursula-Angela relationship, has a smaller role than usual? Do we know much she's in? We mentioned you never see Merkel without Macron. You tend not to see Charles Michel without Ursula von der Leyen. In a minute, can anybody pick up on that point? Janis, do we know the role the Commission is or is not playing, Fabian? Or is that obscured?
I think you clearly, if you compare this to the last MFF round we've had, I mean, not in February, but I mean the last MFF, the Commission at that time was actually not the key player. It is now still a key player. During the entire process, even after it came out with its proposal, it's playing a strong role. It is needed a lot, but let's not forget, this is now politics. And there is the strong argument of, can you trust, at least from the size of the Frugals and others, can you actually trust the Commission to be in the position to deliver? Can you trust them that they will uphold the principles we agree on? So I think it's also wise that the Commission here is a bit careful, but it still is in the center of the game, and it will be very much required in the future, obviously.
Okay, I just want to go back to really where we started and ask you, you know, there's been a lot of talk about this being an existential moment for the EU, a moment when it needs to step up to the plate, demonstrate its relevance, demonstrate that it can act in the face of such an unprecedented situation. And going back to Charles Michel's comment that I mentioned earlier about, will we through a tear present a face of a weak Europe undermined? For each of you, and I'll start with Marta, then Janis, and I would like to give Fabian the last word. Do you believe that this summit or a subsequent summit, and question mark, as they've gone on for 4 days, is it now really not possible to split this into 2 summits? They've got to do it here, or people will say Europe is falling apart. But do you believe that in the end, EU leaders will demonstrate, Marta, that they can rise to this challenge and that they can make sure Europe remains relevant and a key part of the response to what is to come in economic and social terms over the coming months and years? What's your gut feeling right now?
I think they can. I think that negotiations have been going on to this stage. It means that at the end an agreement is very likely. And importantly, I think that if they settle for the numbers we've been talking about, this still remains significant from an economic point of view. There was a risk that it would be watered down to irrelevance, and that probably would have been even worse than nothing. Instead, I think that if what is on the table today is somewhat what the final agreement looked like, I think that would be a good signal for the markets, for international partners, that an agreement on a crucial issue is still doable at European level.
Janis.
No, I'm rather convinced, and I've been also, when we were discussing the MFF over the past weeks, convinced that the chances is high that they will rise to this challenge at this point in time. I think that there is no real alternative in terms of having a failure. A failure would be catastrophic in many ways. It would be poison with respect to the current crisis economically, but also politically. So this actually is not an option. So I think, yes, there will be an agreement. There will be an unprecedented agreement. But we will, as EU27, will have to rise to many more challenges in future. This is a key moment. It is important. Without an agreement, we would be in a horrendous situation. But the situation, unfortunately, as it will be unfolding with respect to the COVID-19 crisis, is not going to unfold in a positive way, which means that we will have more moments of truth. I was never saying that that we are in an existential crisis. We have a fundamental challenge, but there will be more severe challenges. But it's good that we're getting this agreement, because if we wouldn't have gotten this agreement, the existential moment might have come closer.
Okay, so you're feeling pretty positive they'll do it, and that the tone, as it were, of where we are now, despite all the bad temper and so on, is moving. Everything's moving in the right direction. Fabian, for you, is the EU going to meet this moment?
I think it's important we're still at the beginning of a process, and that process will last, unfortunately, a very long time. It is not all about money. There was a question about that. Absolutely, this is not all about money. But while it is not a sufficient condition, it is necessary that we have agreement. We have to have this step to be able to continue working together, cooperating, etc. So uncharacteristically, I would actually say it's not even a question of whether. I want to be a little bit normative. We must. There is just no other alternative.
Correct.
And on that note, the audience can't join me in thanking you, but thank all three of you very much. It's been a long and intense weekend following the twist and you have done it brilliantly. So thank you very much, and particularly to Marta, our special guest this week. That's all from us for today. Thank you to all of you for watching. Things are beginning to wind down, and I hope they are for you too for the summer break. But there are two events, two more EPC events before the summer break, both on Thursday, one on Turkish foreign policy, another on Kosovo's path to visa liberation. And we will see you back here in one form or another after the summer break. But may I wish everybody, I hope, whether you're staycationing or traveling to the extent that you can, may I wish you a very enjoyable and safe summer. Thank you, Janis, Fabian, Marta. Thank you to you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie.